It's been a year since I joined Hero Wars. On a summer day just like today, my faithful homies went to the forest and never returned. As it turned out, they were attacked by a bunch of accursed heroes. A red-headed she-fiend with a chain gun, her loyal priestess of light with a staff, a fiery demon with a reaper's scythe, and a ruthless knight clad in shining armor.
Oh my god, stop it! They're still just kids.
My servants fought with all they had, almost securing a victory. But all of a sudden, swords began raining down from the sky, shredding them to pieces. Watch the story unfold in Hero Wars. Join the game now and get a super chest with 5 top heroes, one of them is a secret, as well as 600 emeralds and 30,000 gold. Scan the QR code or download the game from the link below in the video description, and I'll see you in the Hero Wars. The single worst day of my life started in the unlikeliest of ways, when I took a trip to visit my grandpa over near Omaha, Nebraska. First problem I ran into was the lack of cell signal out there in the sticks. No internet meant my GPS started going haywire, and I've never been great at reading maps. That, and there are basically no road signs anywhere, and the ones that are there are in such bad shape you can barely read them, even if you slow down when passing them. So, in the end, I had to actually stop at some guy's house to ask directions, and the fact that he didn't seem to know where I was talking about didn't fill me with confidence. He mentioned knowing of an old house off a dirt road, maybe a mile or two away from his own. He said it wouldn't be the easiest to find, but he was basically 75% sure that I was close. So, off I went, headed in the direction he was pointing, hoping that I'd make it to my grandpa's before lunchtime. A few minutes later, I spot a dirt road turnoff that I thought might be the one that he was talking about. But after driving down it for a few minutes, I didn't see any houses or anything, so I figured that I made a wrong turn. Not surprising considering how crappy the infrastructure was, but it was still pretty frustrating. But then luckily, I saw a driveway out of nowhere, and I got my hopes up thinking that it was my grandpa's place. It wasn't, as there was a bunch of dudes with a van and a car all stood around talking, and my grandpa wasn't one for company, but I at least figured that I could ask them for some more directions. So that's what I do. But the second I turned into the driveway, I noticed the guy standing around started to act a little anxious. One guy immediately tears away from the little circle they had going. Another starts looking around as if though he was expecting other people to show up or something. I realized that I just interrupted something private. I just didn't realize the danger I'd driven into. Right as I stopped the car, I hear one of the guys say something to another like, "He with you?" Then I took my eyes off of them for a second as I reached for the road map I had. Right as I stopped the car, I hear one of the guys say something to another like, "He with you?" Then I took my eyes off them for a second as I reached for the road map I had. Then, when I looked up again, all I see is a gun pointing at me through my driver's side window. I realize now that in the few seconds that followed that I was just waiting for the guy to pull the trigger. I can't remember thinking anything other than gun, but I didn't move. I just froze. I didn't try to back out or duck or anything, I just sort of waited for everything to turn black. Like on a nature documentary when a deer gets caught by a tiger or something, and they just sort of go limp as they're thinking, well, this is it. Seconds later, I hear the guy with the gun saying, "Turn off the engine." Then when I do, he follows up with, "Get out of the car." I do as he says, feeling my knees wobble a little as I step out onto the dirt outside. I didn't think I could get any more scared, but I was wrong. Because when another guy spoke next, I felt like I honestly could have made an actual mess in my shorts. This guy just pipes up, "He's a cop, man. Just shoot him. Let's get out of here." That suddenly roused me from being all frozen and silent with fear, and I just started saying, I'm not a cop. I swear to God I'm not a cop. I'm just looking for Grandpa's place. Please don't shoot me. Please. I'm not a cop. Please believe me. It all came out in one long, frenzied sentence, and I can't really write it all into this, but I was stammering, shaking. My voice was breaking. I was just a mess. I think this was the same guy who said, He's lying. Just kill him. We can't lose the shipment. That was the only clue I had as to what was going down at that meeting, and I've agreed with a few other people's suggestions that it was drug-related. I didn't know this at the time, but Douglas County, the county that Omaha is in, has a huge meth problem, probably the biggest in the entire country. And as myself and many others suspect, I accidentally stumbled across a meth deal, probably a pretty big one considering some of the hardware on display. Not only did I have some kind of pistol in my face the whole time, but one of the other guys emerged with the kind of gun I've only ever seen on Call of Duty. I'm talking the kind with all kinds of attachments and stuff on it. Like I said, there was a hot minute there where I really did think that I was about to die. But when I heard the guy with the pistol trained on me say, Get the tape, I started to think that they might have something even worse in mind for me. What's weird though is that even though that didn't mean that they were going to kill me, my survival instincts told me, at least that buys us a little more time. Thinking about it, letting them tie me up like they did could have secured my death, not helped me avoid it. But still, I just let them do what they did in the hopes that compliance might lead to mercy. They put tape over my eyes as well as around my wrists and ankles. They made me kneel in the dirt as they frisked me. I'm pretty sure they searched my car too, and I mean it when I said that they had some serious hardware, because I'm assuming you need something pretty advanced to tell if there's no secret recording equipment on a car. One of the guys said, Car's clean for bugs. At one point, and that made me realize those guys weren't your average crankheads. I piped up again that I wasn't a cop, that they could search me all they liked, but they wouldn't find a badge or a gun or anything like that. That didn't seem to satisfy them though, and they kept arguing among themselves about what to do with me. I know they took out my license at one point because I could hear them passing something around, asking each other, You know this guy? Or, You recognize him? Stuff like that. I can't even describe how relieved I was when I heard them all agree that they'd never seen me before, and that I probably wasn't any kind of undercover cop or anything. I was praying that meant they wouldn't kill me, but at the same time, I knew it meant that I was still in quite a bit of trouble. Not long after that, they started discussing what they were going to do with me. The guy who had been suggesting they kill me kept on making that suggestion, but then the guy who ordered me tied up, the same one who first pulled a gun on me, he kept telling him to shut up, saying that killing me was a bad idea, that it'd only bring down more heat on them. During those few minutes of pure terror, he was like my best friend in the world. As if it had been the bloodthirsty one in charge, I definitely wouldn't be around to write this. But then, right as it seemed like I was going to get away unharmed, the boss of the group seemed to have a sudden change of heart. He said something like, You know what? I think you might be right. We can't risk it. He's probably a do-gooder who's going to go straight to the cops. I started wailing about how I wasn't, how I'd never snitch, how I'd just drive off and forget what I saw, causing them no trouble whatsoever. But that just didn't seem to do the trick, and when I heard the boss doing something with his gun, I begged him over and over not to kill me. I tried everything, reminding him that it would be too much trouble, that I was sorry for interrupting them, that I didn't see anything, but not a word that came out of my mouth seemed to change his mind. I haven't even finished talking when I felt him press the gun to the back of my head, and as I felt myself starting to cry under the tape they'd wrapped around my eyes, I wished I'd never gotten out of bed that morning. The last thing I heard him say before he pulled the trigger was, "Start digging a hole." And then, after every muscle in my body seemed to tense up in preparation for oblivion, I heard the trigger pull with a dull click that seemed to echo around my skull. But then, there was nothing. No bang, no pain, no blood or brains. I wasn't falling forward or backward or whatever. I was still just kneeling there, tensed up, feeling the pee trickle down my thigh, sadly. And all I could hear was laughter. They were all laughing at me, laughing at how I'd begged and pleaded with them not to kill me, when it was all just some cruel prank to instill the fear of God into me. And let me tell you, it worked. I felt the hot breath of the boss on my neck as he must have leaned down to tell me something like, "Keeping your license. Anything happens, I'm sending someone to pay you a visit. Think of it as an insurance policy. And next time, there'll be one in the chamber." I was later told this was called dry firing, or something like that anyway, where you fire a gun with nothing in the chamber so all it does is click real loud. Or at least, it felt loud to me. After that, they tossed me in the backseat of a car, and from the very short distance that I was moved, I figured that I was back on my own. Not long after, I heard engines gunning, then moving vehicles, then silence. They left me there, in the back of my car, tied up and blindfolded for what felt like days. In reality, it was only around 24 hours, and if a passing farmer using the back roads hadn't spotted me, there's a chance I might have died of dehydration. My phone had upwards of 50 missed calls. I'd been reported missing by my parents. It was a whole ordeal. And obviously a big part of what followed was being questioned by the police. I didn't ask to talk to them, but considering how I was found, my parents wanted me to talk. I just stonewalled the deputy who showed up, then told my parents why I'd refused a word about what happened. That was honestly the worst part. Having my own life threatened, and being subjected to what amounted to a mock execution, that was one thing. But having my own mom and dad realize that they were no longer safe in their own home, that was another thing entirely. We moved a short while after that, living with family in Des Moines for a few weeks after we could find an apartment, which mom and dad then used as a base to sell their house. Every so often, the cruel, maddening chaos of it all hits me all at once. All that, our entire lives uprooted, all because of one wrong turn I made on a dirt road, out in Douglas County, Nebraska. A few years back, I was out elk hunting with my brother up in Alberta, Canada. That morning, my hunting buddy Paul and I were headed out to hunt near the Simonette River, but I only had my rifle with me since Rob didn't have a big game license at the time. As some of you might know, the banks of the Simonette are very much considered bear country, and since one half of our hunting party was very vulnerable without a firearm, we hit up the nearest ranger station and asked about bear sightings. The ranger was very helpful and warned us that there was definitely a grizzly in the area. They had been tracking sightings for weeks though, and the ranger told us that if we stuck to certain trails and avoided others, we might be able to stay out of the bear's territory, which would lower our chances of encouraging it. That might seem silly to people who understand how vast a grizzly's territory can be, but up here we believe that mitigation can be just as effective as outright protection. Anyway, we had been walking for about an hour or so. Because there was a fresh blanket of snow on the ground, it was much harder to recognize where each trail turned off, etc. Suddenly, we both realized that we might have taken a wrong turn a mile or so back, because we didn't seem to recognize where we were. We decided to make our way back to the truck so we could better orient ourselves, when we suddenly noticed fresh wolf tracks in the snow. Wolves generally aren't as dangerous as bears, as they're way too smart to attack humans, but it still meant we got a little tense as we carried on padding through the snow in dead silence. Moments later, we caught a glimpse of an animal carcass just laying there in the snow, and it was only barely touched with no other scavengers near it. This was a huge red flag to us, as the crows tend to descend on anything that doesn't have an apex predator near it, so we both started to worry that we were about to encounter something we really didn't want to. I loaded my rifle as we slowly approached, thinking we might be in for a close encounter with a wolf or a wolf pack. who would be wanting to defend the carcass, obviously. As we both scanned the area, extremely on edge by that point, I heard this low calling sound, but this huge spruce seemed to be blocking my view of where it was coming from, so I couldn't exactly see what was making it. That's when Paul suddenly let out this terrified, high-pitched cry of grizzly. And then the next second, all I see is this huge bear charging right at him. If you haven't seen how fast a grizzly can charge, it's hard to imagine how such a lumbering beast can achieve such frightening speeds. But I can assure you, when they want to, those things can fly at you like a freaking fury cannonball. It is truly terrifying to behold. The bear moved so fast that I barely had time to react, and definitely not enough time to raise my rifle to actually aim. But still, I had to get a shot off even if it was just to scare it, so I tried my best to aim from the hip and hit the bear in the head. I turned, fired, and nothing. The bear didn't even so much as flinch. Luckily, Paul was able to take cover behind these two trees that were pretty close together, so they acted kind of like a palisade between him and the bear. The grizzly took a swipe at him, missed, and then just kept moving around the tree before turning in my direction. I don't think I can even really describe the kind of terror I felt in that moment. It's like nothing I've ever felt before or since. We, humanity I mean, spend so much time dreaming up imaginary monsters for books or movies or comic books, when there are real-life monsters just walking the earth alongside us. And up near the Simonette that day, I had one charging right at me. It must have been no more than 8 meters away from me when I reloaded my rifle and fired again. That time I actually hit it, and I saw a spray of blood in the air from where the bullet tore through its shoulder. But to my horror, it just didn't seem to flinch that time either. I had to fall back onto my butt to dodge the swipe it took at me, and as I kept on crawling back through the snow, I just couldn't get the leverage to properly reload my rifle. It took another swipe at me, but I knew then that it must have pulled a bullet through its arm or shoulder because the force wasn't as powerful as I thought it would be, and I saw a few drops of blood hit the snow in front of me. It probably realized that it wouldn't be able to kill me just with its claws, so that's when the bear opened up its mouth to bite me, lunging forward as I lay there in the snow. I didn't really plan on it. What I did next was all out of pure instinct, but I just shoved my gun barrel towards it to try and keep it from biting me, and I watched the barrel disappear down its throat. It actually bit down on that thing, and I swear I heard one or two of its teeth shatter as it chewed on the cold steel for a few seconds. It pushed the rifle butt down onto me, and that gave me the leverage I needed to actually work the bolt again to put another round in the chamber. Seconds later, I pulled the trigger and sent the bullet either right through its brain or through its spine, because it just went completely limp and rolled onto its side in the snow. The whole event lasted no more than maybe 20 or 30 seconds, but it was the most terrified I've been in my entire life. But the aftermath was probably worse. You'd think that after surviving something like that, you'd be all like, man, screw that bear. But I just felt this sickening regret. Grizzlies are beautiful animals, and if there were another way, I would have let it live, but it just didn't give me that option. In that moment, it was either it or me. There was no reasoning with it, no negotiating with it, no communicating with it outside of pure violence. And I think that's what scares me about nature most of all. How one of humanity's most powerful tools is our power to communicate. But out there in nature, it's almost useless. If Mother Nature wants you dead, there's no stopping it. Either you die or it dies. There is no in between. Back in the 1950s, my grandpa used to sell vacuum cleaners door to door all over the country. He was one of the last great American traveling salesmen, the kind Arthur Miller wrote about, but with considerably less family trauma. He used to say how he had his fair share of close encounters with bad folks, as he called them, but he also had this one story that really stuck with me for obvious reasons. So, he's down in Florida when he runs into a friend of his out on the road, a guy who sold steam irons. The guy tells him that he just visited a place where the homeowner already owned a steam iron but was in the market for a vacuum cleaner. This is way back when Walmarts didn't exist, and getting a hold of items like that was way tougher than it is now. Plus, this guy was an old-timer who didn't get out all that much. Anyways, he gives my grandpa the hint. Grandpa thanks him, then heads out to look for the property. He's following the guy's directions to the letter, and he's even got a description of the guy's house too, so when he turns down some old dirt road and the house didn't look like the one described, he figured that he'd probably made a wrong turn. Lo and behold, the number is different on the mailbox, but given how he was already there, he figured that he'll try and sell a vacuum anyhow. Then, as he's walking up to the guy's door, he sees this real lifelike alligator statue thing on the guy's front porch. Then as he gets closer, he realizes it had to be stuffed or something because it's super realistic. It's just not moving or anything. He gets within about 3 feet of the guy's door, and he's got his eyes glued on this creepily realistic gator when out of nowhere, the gator statue blinks. My grandpa said he froze. Then right as he did, the gator turns its head and hisses. He turns and bolts back to his car, and the whole way he can hear this thing chasing him. Then when he gets to his car door and turns around, it's like right there trying to bite at his ankles. Said he'd never been so scared in all his life. The guy had a freaking guard gator. Not a guard dog, a guard gator. So my grandpa just guns his car engine and gets out of there. A few years ago, I had this really erratic schedule where I had to get up super early for school before going to my part-time job until 10 or 11 at night. I think there was about 3 months there where I didn't get any more than about 5 hours of sleep at night, and after a while, it started to have a really terrible effect on me. I found my memory started to become shot, my mood was seriously affected, and life in general just got really, really tough. I started making basic mistakes on a daily basis, and while some were just irritating, one almost cost me my life. It was when I was driving home one night, and although I made the same journey maybe 100 times before, my overtired brain was at a breaking point, and I made a wrong turn. I know what you're thinking. That's just a minor inconvenience. I could have just turned around and corrected my course. But this wrong turn was down a one-way street, and as fate would have it, some motocross-mounted joyrider was coming the other way doing maybe 40 to 50. There wasn't a thing I could do about it, and the kid had no helmet on either, so the second I hit him, his head smashed right through my windshield, his body stopping only as his shoulders hit the crunched-up glass. It was the most horrific sight I've ever seen in my entire life. The kid's head was almost completely split open. There was no way he was alive, at least, that's what I thought at first. But then, as my screams finally died down, I could hear him groaning, with all these gurgles coming from where there was blood or something in his throat. I heard those sounds in my nightmares for months afterwards. The kid died on his way to the hospital, and I thought I was going to go to prison over it. I mean, I honestly believed that I deserved to go to jail for a long time. It took a lot for people to talk me down and tell me that the kid was ripping it down a street on a stolen bike, wearing no helmet, and if he hadn't made that choice, he'd still be alive. I just made one dumb mistake, but the kid had made a fatal, criminal one. I still can't really justify it to myself, and even though the state didn't choose to prosecute, his mom tried to make a civil suit to get some money out of me. I tried to offer her enough to cover the kid's funeral, but she wanted more. She wanted to see me in court. But then the whole civil suit was thrown out because of the whole Grand Theft Auto thing. I understand where she was coming from, though. She didn't want it to be nice and respectful or like charity. She wanted to take something from me, just like I'd taken something from her. I still go to therapy over the whole thing, and I sometimes still see that kid's face in my dreams, the way his eye was bulging out with his head split open. But somehow he was still alive. groaning and gurgling his final breaths away, all because I went the wrong way down a one-way street. On March 14th of 2014, two Dutch students named Lisanne Froon and Chris Kramers traveled to Panama for an adventure vacation. They planned to do their fair share of relaxing on the golden sands of Panama's beaches, but they also had their hearts set on some selfless humanitarian work. Before their departure from their native Holland, the girls had contacted a school in a small town on the Caldera River named Boquete, asking if they needed any volunteers during the upcoming semester. Their assistance was eagerly accepted by the understaffed and under-resourced escuela, but upon arriving in the village a few weeks early, they discovered that it wasn't all that they'd hoped for. Chris Kramers wrote in her diary that the villagers were rude and not at all friendly, and that their trip had proven to be a real disappointment. In order to offset what a letdown the initial phase of their trip had been, the two girls planned to hike around the active Baru volcano on April 1st of 2014. The 3-mile hiking trail that surrounds the Baru volcano is relatively easy to explore, but as the two girls set off from Boquete at around 11 a.m., it proved to be one of the last times anyone would see them alive. Accompanied by a local dog named Blue, Lisanne and Chris walked along the Pianista Trail, stopped only at an inn to ask directions. It's not clear why the innkeeper would do so, but it was later discovered that he advised the girls to immediately take a taxi back into Boquete. None of the local villagers would admit to there being any kind of threat of danger on the Pianista Trail, but if that was the case, why would the innkeeper advise the girls to immediately call off their hike? The Boquete villagers began to suspect something terrible had happened when the dog, Blue, returned from the hike unaccompanied, but for some reason they waited until the following day to report Lisanne and Chris missing. Again, it's not clear why they would wait to do this, and it suggests that they knew of something dangerous on the trail, something that was to be avoided for at least 24 hours. 2 days later, the girls' family became concerned by the lack of communication and reported them missing to local authorities. Their report sparked a search of the surrounding area that was conducted both on foot and using aerial assets, but not a trace of either girl could be found. Just less than a week after they first went missing, the Froon and Kramers families became so racked with worry that they flew out to Panama to assist in the search and were accompanied by members of the Dutch police's missing persons department. The Dutch police officers interviewed the Boquete villagers and were told that it was more than likely that the two girls had taken a wrong turn on the mountain somewhere and were simply lost in the forest. Yet it didn't take long for the detectives to notice some serious inconsistencies in the villagers' stories, and they became suspicious that the girls had been the victim of some kind of criminal activity. Over the next 10 weeks, search teams led tracker dogs through the stretches of forest that the two girls were believed to have traversed, but again, not a trace of the two girls could be located. Authorities would have to wait until June of 2014 for any kind of break in the case, and this came in the form of a woman from the local Nagabe tribe who showed up at a police station with something very disconcerting in her possession. The woman had found a blue backpack that she claimed she found along the bank of a nearby river. The backpack contained sunglasses, a camera, 2 cell phones, money, 2 bras, a water bottle, and Lisanne Froon's passport. Investigators immediately set about analyzing Lisanne's phone, and it was through this process that they discovered something as confusing as it was disturbing. The phone had remained active for almost 10 days after the pair had initially gone missing, and during this time, they had made repeated attempts to summon help for themselves. They had made a number of 112 calls, which is the Dutch emergency number, as well as using 911 in an attempt to contact Panamanian emergency services. A number of these calls actually connected for a time, but due to a poor cell reception in the area, the longest of them lasted only 2 seconds before the signal dropped. Not long after the analysis of Lisanne Froon's phone, Chris Kramers was located a short distance away, and after a similar analysis was performed on it, authorities discovered something very frightening indeed. Someone had locked Chris's phone by entering the wrong PIN code on several different occasions, powering it on one final time on April 11th, before both phones would be switched off until they were found. The phone's activity had initially suggested that at least one of the girls remained alive around 5 days after they went missing, but the locking of Chris's phone through incorrect PIN code entries told them something very different and reasserted the possibility of there being criminal activity. Obviously, both the authorities and the girls' families found this all deeply concerning, but it wasn't until they examined the girls' camera that a truly terrifying scenario began to unfold. The camera's memory card contained more than 100 pictures, with the first 50 or 60 consisting of regular tourist-style photographs of the two girls smiling or posing. Yet as investigators continued to scroll through the pictures, the tone of the images began to shift dramatically. One photograph showed Chris Kramers with a look of pure terror on her face and was dated around the time the girls began to contact emergency services. The remainder of the photos were taken from April 8th between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. and depicted seemingly random objects like a stick with plastic sticking to it, clumps of foliage, a canyon, or a bridge. Investigators suggested that due to the steady framing of the shots, they were intentionally taken, perhaps to serve as trail markers to help the young women navigate their route, or even as a way for rescue workers to locate them should they have discovered the camera before the girls themselves. The girls may have also been using the camera's flash as a light source or perhaps to scare off predatory animals, but there were others who suggested that neither Froon nor Kramers took the photos and that a potential abductor had taken them while playing with the camera. Lisanna Froon's parents were extremely upset when they saw the rough and frightened state their daughters were in, and begged the authorities not to release any of them to the public. Yet despite their wishes, a Panamanian news channel accidentally leaked some of the photos, and the same thing happened back in Holland. The latter featured a picture which appeared to show the back of one of the girls' heads, and whoever it was sporting a rather severe head wound with blood matted in her hair. The leak sparked off wild speculation that not only had the girls been kidnapped, but that an attacker had actually taken pictures of his victims to serve as a kind of grim series of trophies. After the discovery of the backpack, the search teams shifted to the area it was found, scouring the banks of the Rio Culebra along the small village of Alto Romero. Alto Romero was a long way from the trail that Kramers and Froon originally set out for, further cementing the idea that they had somehow gotten lost after taking a wrong turn. Shortly after the teams commenced with their new search area, they found a bunch of Chris Kramers' clothing by the river's edge. Each item had been neatly folded and placed on the river's edge and appeared to be on the opposite side of the bank from where the photographs had been taken. Some suspected that local tribesmen had found the discarded clothes and had folded them neatly in the hopes that someone might return for them. This led to a great number of them being questioned in relation to the girls' disappearance, but none admitted to seeing them, either alive or dead. 2 months after the search teams focused their efforts around Alto Romero, the first human remains were finally discovered. One of the search teams discovered a hiking shoe behind a tree along the same stretch of river where Lisanna's backpack had been found. Initially, they believed that it was just another spare item of clothing, but upon further inspection, the shoe contained a severed human foot. By the end of August, DNA analysis had successfully determined that the foot had belonged to Lisanna Froon, and further searches had turned up pieces of rotten flesh that were a DNA match for Chris Kramers. It was a heartbreaking revelation for the girls' families, as it meant that the chances of their daughter's survival were extremely slim. Yet the question remained, how on earth did their bodies end up in such a gruesome state of dismemberment? It took until March of 2015, almost a year after Kramers and Froon traveled to Panama, for investigators finally to reach their ultimate conclusion. In their eyes, the two girls most likely suffered some sort of tragic accident along the trail after becoming lost in the forest. The catastrophic ankle break that Lisanna suffered suggested that she had fallen a great distance before passing away either in or near the river. Chris Kramer had probably then attempted to climb down the cliff face in the dark, but due to the low light conditions, could not find Lisana or her way back to the trail. Chris had then died somehow while trying to exit the forest, leaving Lisana dead or dying somewhere in the darkness. Her remains then decomposed, and thanks to the river and the intense tropical rainfall, had ended up scattered for miles down the river. For some, there was finally a solid resolution to the mystery, but for others, morbid mysteries still abounded. One of the staff writers of the Panamanian newspaper La Estrella de la Coryat claimed the authorities had completely botched their handling of the case. She reported there was no chain of custody established for the recovered evidence or any human remains. She also reported that the 30-plus fingerprints found on the backpack not only remain unidentified, but that not a single one of the indigenous people involved with the case had their prints recorded in order to eliminate them from suspicion. The reporter also raised additional concerns over the analysis of the girl's camera and phones, claiming that the condition of the equipment was inconsistent with the places it was discovered. She claimed to have seen photographs of the equipment and argued that the lack of damage to the items was extremely suspicious, almost as if though the police had recovered them from a home or dwelling and not from the rainforest as they'd previously claimed. The reporter also said that only a skin-deep analysis on the camera had been performed, and that although it was possible to scour the memory cards for pictures that had been deleted, the Panamanian police had completely neglected to do so, even though this could have provided vital clues as to exactly what happened on the day of the girl's death. Panamanian lawyer Enrique Arocha, who was employed by the heartbroken Kramer's family, also voiced his concerns regarding the handling of evidence. He claimed despite reports to the contrary, no forensic investigation was conducted at the site the girls' bodies were found. On top of this, many of the investigation sources remain completely unverified, meaning for all intent and purposes, police officers could have simply fabricated them. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Enrique claimed that neither Chris nor Lisana's skulls were ever recovered, and that despite intensive searches of the area around Alto Romero, the most important pieces of their skeletons were never found. If the two girls died of accidental injuries, it seems extremely unlikely that neither's skull would ever be recovered, and Enrique believes that this is the most compelling evidence of foul play in the entire case. In light of law enforcement's mismanagement of the girls' deaths, a number of conspiracy theories and suggestions of cover-ups have gathered momentum. Some critics have asserted that the indigenous tribespeople of the area may have murdered the two girls, and are now masking their involvement in the crime by turning over evidence and pretending to cooperate. Some have even argued that the missing thigh bones and skulls are evidence that the two girls were cannibalized following their deaths. Others have suggested that the girls fell victim to narcos or organ traffickers, which would explain why their bodies were in pieces. While there is no shortage of theories regarding the grim truth of what happened that day, one common thread runs through all of them, and that's how the Panamanian authorities have remained suspiciously quiet and inactive regarding the investigation during the years that followed. It's entirely possible that this was done to protect Panama's tourism industry, which is essential to its fledgling economy. Yet others have suggested that narco-traffickers have paid off key members of the government in order to prevent international authorities from discovering their involvement in the girls' deaths and hindering their multi-million-dollar businesses. When all is said and done, the key question in this case is, did someone actually murder Chris Kramers and Lisana Froon? Or was it all just a horrible accident? As much as the Panamanian government might be uncomfortable admitting it, between the years 2009 and 2017, 24 other tourists have either gone missing while hiking in Panama or have turned up dead under extremely mysterious circumstances. In 2017, independent journalists from both Panama and the United States conducted an investigation into the deaths and disappearances, with each coming to the same conclusion, that they might all be the work of an unidentified serial killer. Leaked forensic documents suggested someone dismembered the young women and scattered the remains deliberately, which is exactly what seems to have occurred with many of the other victims. The most insidious and dangerous thing about this particular case is that, in covering up such a frightening series of murders, the Panamanian authorities aren't just denying justice to the Froon and Kramers families, they're essentially digging the graves of many more victims. If there really is a serial killer at work, targeting tourists on the jungle trails of Panama, there's certainly no shortage of potential victims to choose from. So if you're planning a trip down to Panama, maybe avoid hiking around the Pianista Trail, as you might have to worry about something far more terrifying than jaguars. On February 7th of 2018, 49-year-old Canadian firefighter Danny Philippidis was on a skiing trip at the Whiteface Mountain in Wilmington, New York. The event was a regular annual event attended by both active and retired firefighters, and on the day in question, Danny and his 8 companions decided to ski one of the highest peaks in the Adirondacks. All could have been considered accomplished skiers, but even the hardiest of athletes would have found this particular run to be thoroughly exhausting. So in the mid-afternoon, the majority of Danny's group decided to call it quits. Danny, however, wanted one more run before he retired for the day, with his friends waiting for him at a ski lodge about halfway down the mountain. Yet just as they were awaiting his arrival, one of the worst snowstorms of the decade struck Whiteface Mountain, rendering visibility almost non-existent. Naturally, Danny's friends were extremely concerned for his well-being, and when he failed to return at the time they expected him to, they ventured up to the resort that they were staying at to report him missing. Search and rescue teams began to scour the mountain for any sign of the missing firefighter, but despite an all-night search of the area, Danny was nowhere to be found. The following day, scores more joined the search teams, including state police, the U.S. Border Patrol, and dozens of civilian volunteers. Some theorized that Danny had simply packed up his belongings and gone back to Canada, but a search of his hotel room revealed that he'd left his passport and other essentials behind, meaning he had to be somewhere in the vicinity. When word of Danny's disappearance reached the Toronto Fire Department, more than 100 active and former firefighters traveled down to Wilmington to aid in the search. And over the course of the following week, a total of over 6,000 people worked in shifts in an attempt to bring him home safely. Thankfully, 6 days after going missing, Danny was found alive and well, but in a place that no one ever expected him to show up. Danny wasn't in New York at all, nor was he in Canada. He was almost 3,000 miles away, in the state of California. The story of his re-emergence began at around 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday, February 13th. Danny's wife was in a meeting with one of the search parties near Lake Placid when she received a very bizarre phone call from a phone number she didn't recognize. Her phone had been ringing almost non-stop all week, so it wasn't unusual to receive such a mysterious call. But when she picked up the phone and heard the voice on the other end, her knees just about buckled with relief. It was Danny, using an old pet name for her that he'd used for years. When she asked where he was, he told her he was on the other side of the country, at Sacramento Airport. Danny's wife could tell just from his voice that he was very unwell, so she told him to hang up, seek help, and inform those who came to his aid that he was a missing person. Sacramento police rushed to Danny's aid, finding him in a state of extreme disorientation at the airport's car rental terminal, still wearing the ski clothes he had on when he went missing 6 days prior. He had no idea what day it was, and when asked to describe a nearby road sign in order to determine his state of mind, he mistook the obvious blue for a bright green. He was also in possession of a brand new iPhone, having no idea where he'd bought it, and when he returned home, those that knew noticed that he'd gotten a haircut in the time that he'd been missing. When asked how he'd gotten to California, Danny claimed that he couldn't remember and was the first person to suggest that his patchy memory was down to some kind of head injury he'd suffered while skiing. However, he did have vivid memories of sitting in the passenger seat of an 18-wheeler and that he'd slept a lot during his journey. Following a brief, on-the-spot assessment, Danny was quickly taken to a nearby hospital to be checked over for a possible head trauma. Yet surprisingly, he was soon discharged with no signs of any injuries being found. According to a Sergeant Sean Hampton of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, police officers conversed with Danny for quite some time at the airport, and all of them were sufficiently confident that he was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They came to the conclusion that Danny had been dropped off at the airport on the night before he was found, and that based on what little he could remember, must have slept roughly near Richards Boulevard before making his way to the airport just before dawn. Given how mysteriously fascinating Danny's case was, it wasn't long before the national media was engaged in a comprehensive search for the truth. Pictures of Danny, as well as the clothes that he was wearing at the time of his disappearance, were broadcast all over the United States and Canada, in the hopes that someone who encountered him on his journey might come forward to share what they knew. A particular amount of effort was poured into an attempt to find the truck drivers that Danny had ridden with on his 6-day journey. But despite the massive amount of publicity, not a single one of them came forward to identify themselves. It was only 6 months after being back in his native Toronto that Danny believed he had pieced together a solid picture of what had happened during the 6 days he was missing. In an interview with a major Canadian news outlet, Danny stated that the whole ordeal had started when he made a wrong turn while skiing down Whiteface Mountain. After taking this wrong turn, Danny believed he had taken a nasty fall, banged his head, and lost consciousness. Then, after waking up, he walked to the main ski lodge only to find it was closed. In reality, this is highly unlikely as rescue teams were searching this area intensively, and it's more probable that he mistake the children's programming area for the main lodge, a place that was most definitely closed at the time of his disappearance. Being extremely dazed and confused at this point, Danny claimed he walked all the way to a nearby highway before thumbing down a ride from a passing trucker. It's here that his memory becomes very patchy, and that he only remembers vomiting at a truck stop before learning that he was halfway across the country in the state of Utah. He remembered experiencing a crushing headache and intense fatigue during this moment of lucidity, and that all he wanted to do was sleep as he continued his journey west. Towards the end of the journey, the mysterious trucker who gave Danny a ride claimed that they had reached what he called the end of the line before dropping him off in Sacramento. Danny claimed that he couldn't remember the driver's name or what they spoke about, and to this day the identity of the trucker remains completely unknown. Upon reaching downtown Sacramento, Danny claimed that he suddenly realized the gravity of his situation, and he knew he needed to contact his loved ones. It's then that he took out $1,000 in cash from a credit card in order to buy a phone, but that he had no idea how he'd gotten hold of the card itself. It's also somewhat of a mystery that he didn't just use a payphone or buy a cheaper variety of phone if it was just to make one phone call. But of all the mysteries this case consists of, this is by far one of the minor ones. A bigger mystery is why, after Danny realized that he was on the opposite side of the United States, as well as a missing person, he chose not to contact family or call 911, but instead opted to sleep on the streets overnight. It's possible that he still felt exhausted and wasn't thinking properly, but the man himself had no concrete explanation for his behavior at that point. The next morning, still in his ski clothing, Danny hitched a ride to Sacramento Airport, and it's around this time that he claimed he suddenly remembered his wife's phone number. He then made contact with her, and the rest we already know. Medical professionals have suggested that Danny's bizarre behavior could have been caused by one of two things. Dr. Charles Tater, a Toronto-based brain surgeon, believes that Danny was suffering from retrograde amnesia, the loss of memory resulting from a blow to the head. If Danny had indeed suffered a head injury after his wrong turn, it's possible that the resulting concussion caused gaps in his memory. Yet retrograde amnesia tends to last anywhere from a few seconds to 48 hours, meaning it wouldn't account for the entirety of Danny's memory loss. On the other hand, Dr. Jennifer Ryan, a senior scientist at Toronto's Rotman Research Institute, argues that Danny experienced another form of amnesia in the form of a dissociative fugue state. Derived from the Latin word for flight, a fugue state is a rare mental condition which can be triggered by a head injury, but can also be caused by a traumatic event or emotional disturbance. People with dissociative fugue have been known to temporarily lose their sense of personal identity before impulsively wandering far from their usual surroundings. They may not show any signs of illness or injury, but instead exhibit radically different behavior and have extreme difficulty remembering who or where they are. Dr. Ryan states that subjects typically don't remember the traveling itself. Rather, their memory kicks in when they find themselves in a new, unfamiliar location. The real problem with amnesic episodes like this is that some subjects never fully recover these lost moments, leaving them with what are known as islands of memory that remain forever lost to them. This may well prove to be the case with Danny Philippidis, meaning the missing pieces to the puzzle might never be unearthed. Incidents like Danny's disappearance show how fragile our minds really are. For all intent and purpose, Danny Philippidis was dead for a few days. It might have been a kind of identity death, and not a physical death. But what's the difference when the very memory banks that make up our personas are suddenly wiped? Maybe if he had hit his head a little harder after that fateful wrong turn, the Danny Philippidis he'd once been might have never, ever returned. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your stories featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Ticks talk on TikTok.
So, some setup stuff about myself before I get to the meat of the story. Specifically Yamhill County, a moderately sized, mostly rural county. I'm half Native American and half Caucasian. Unfortunately, as I live in Oregon and my tribe lives elsewhere, and because of the pandemic going on right now, I haven't been able to visit my specific tribe as of yet. I'm over 18, though I don't want to disclose my own age for privacy reasons. I live with my mum, who is where I get my Caucasian from, and sister too, and my dad passed away about 2.5 years ago. We also have 3 dogs of varying size and 4 outdoor cats. In the part of Oregon that I live in, you're never even 10 minutes away from a forest, 20 from a mountaintop, and even in cities too. There's plenty of forestry just pretty much everywhere, but I live just outside of one of these towns, only a short several-minute drive away, but far enough to where light pollution doesn't heavily affect me, and I can still see the stars rather clearly. I've lived in this house since I was a kid, and though I've always gotten the creeps about this place since it's next to a giant forest, it's been a while since anything that I could categorize as paranormal happened to me. I'm also generally a pretty skeptical person and not so superstitious, if I'm being honest. I think science could explain around 95% of the world's mysteries, though I've seen some stuff that I still have no rational explanation for, I'll admit. And the things that have happened to me over the past 3 days definitely fall solidly into that category. I know a decent bit about skinwalkers. They come from the Ute and Navajo tribe legends, being witches that are the antithesis to medicine men, commonly found around the Four Corners area of the US and around Navajo reservations, but my knowledge is limited to different internet retellings of the legends, so I only know a few baseline rules. Don't fall for their imitation voices. If you smell dead, rotting meat, then you need to leave ASAP. Don't acknowledge its presence directly. Don't say its name out loud unless you want to attract one, and if you want to harm one, you'll need white ashes, like that from burnt wood. You can also burn sage if you suspect one being near you or hunting you, and if you happen to spot its true human identity, then you can say its name and accuse it of being a skinwalker to apparently kill it. How much of that is true, I am still totally unsure of, obviously, for a number of reasons too, but The largest being that I don't think any of the videos I watched were made by natives who would probably have more intimate knowledge of these creatures, but I could be talking out of my butt for sure on that one, and I don't know, it could be completely different for all I know. But also some background for this property too. According to the previous owners, who are a part of a family who have lived here for generations, there was once a log cabin built here on top of a native burial ground, which is also on a long inactive volcano. Sounds cliche, I know, but apparently it's absolutely true as far as I can tell. The burial ground part at least, and the inactive volcano part apparently is fully true as well, but I don't know. But what I do know is that there have been a number of odd, unexplainable phenomena here, which I'll try to keep short, but here it goes. So, the most notable one includes 12-foot metal doors belonging to a car paint booth being shook intensely by absolutely nothing. An old 50s metal gas oil can flying up from behind a ton of junk and flying directly at one of my dad's friends. A running sound, followed up by the mirror door in my parents' bedroom being shattered at 3 a.m. one night. And at the exact same time, my dad's best man apparently died. And needless to say that, while I haven't encountered any Bigfoot or Mothman or anything like that, I've seen some stranger things that have no logical explanation. So the property I live on is around 10 acres in size. The house is decently large with a one-car garage and office, which is where my sister is currently chilling out at, next to it, and a large metal garage around 200 yards east from the house. The smaller garage and the house have motion lights all around their perimeters for proper illumination in case anything or anyone gets near the house, but the larger garage only has like a halogen bulb outside of its main door that went out last week in fact, and now at night that entire area of the property is just pitch black. The house has 3 doors too, 2 on a porch, 2 to the front yard and driveway, 1 to the laundry room and into the backyard. The one on the eastmost side is the living room one with 9 windows and 1 of the doors, a kitchen area with a view onto the porch, another living room type area, and then halfway to the bathrooms and the bedrooms too. The office in the smaller garage has 2 entrances, one heading directly into the backyard that's sliding glass, and 2 partially iron, partially glass doors that head into the garage itself. The metal garage was actually built over the aforementioned cabin and has an attic that spans over the entire length of it. It has a car lift, a paint booth that can fit a limousine, a bathroom, and also scaffolding with a heater in it, which is where apparently the gas can flew from. Around 15 feet behind the shop is a large forest that I've never stepped foot into due to there being a crazy old man living in it. While I haven't stepped into it too, my sister and her friends have headed in a few times, each time returning with odd objects too. And although they haven't gone into the forest for like several years now, I do remember them bringing out stuff like Baphomet statues, animal bones, and weird sort of rocks before. Aside from these though, the only things we see out here animal-wise are does and baby deer just passing on through our yard to get into the forest. But now for the current events. So, around 4 a.m. on Saturday night, I was preparing to go to bed out in my family living room. My room is painted black, and being the summer here, it gets ridiculously hot at day, and I don't have good AC at the moment, so I'm sleeping out in the living room. But as I was about to go to sleep, I heard the cats fighting. Something not that odd, they're mostly males and get pretty riled up from time to time, but then I heard something else. There were 3 distinct knocks on one of my front doors. This immediately freaked me out for a few reasons. For one, it's like 4 a.m. and pitch black outside, and these knocks were far too loud for an animal to make, and sounded just far too high for them either. And second, my motion tracker lights were still off. After the knocking, my dogs headed towards the other front door. This one is the partially iron one, partially glass, like those on the office, and they just completely lost their minds with barking. Something they only ever do when they see something that they don't recognize. At this, I locked all my windows, closed all the blinds, and I just sat on my couch bed. In my living room, facing out towards the front yard, there's a half-circle-shaped window with no blinds that allows me to see when the motion tracker turns on or off, and I just sat there, staring at this window for about an hour and a half until they finally came on, and then the sun came up. I didn't really have the courage to go and look as to what caused the lights to trigger, but anyway, the next morning I asked my mum if she heard a knocking on the door to get a disturbing answer from her and my sister, because my mum had also heard the knocking, but also heard it on her windows to the bedroom, and my sister heard it knocking on the sliding glass door to the office too. I knew then that this was something that had knocked multiple times, as there was just no way that I could have mistaken the tapping on my door for something tapping on my sister's door. While the sun was up, my sister and I bought some sage, since from what I know it wards off skinwalkers and other things, but my mum accidentally misplaced it before we could burn it. And by the time that we realized that we couldn't find it, the shop that we went to had closed, so we had to just hope nothing worse would happen that night. But the second night was so much more disturbing than the first. While I didn't spot anything, I definitely heard a loud ambient noise coming from the woods. The nearest broad comparison that I could make is like how a city sounds at night when there's construction, but this sounded more natural in origin, in some really odd way. Another much more niche comparison would be the song Cave of the Past from Earthbound, as it's the only song that I can think of that fits the ambience. But I heard this thing for what must have been around half an hour while I walked my dogs in my front yard, and while I wanted to just stay inside and drown out my paranoia with some anime, my mum had me take out the dogs, claiming that there's nothing out there that could harm you. And this in spite of the fact that she heard the knocking the night before. As I was walking the last dog, though, I heard something from the forest to the east, and it sounded like maybe chanting? I only heard about one short sentence in some dialect that I couldn't discern, but that was all I needed to hear in order to head inside and lock everything up again. From there, I could hear the ambience, though, even inside my house, and was up again until the sun crested over the hills. One more thing, too, about this night, though, was that there was a light that refused to go out. It was one of the motion trackers on the one car garage, and each time I would look out at it, I wouldn't see anything, but yet it just stayed on all throughout the night. Anyway, finally tonight, I woke up late, as staying up until sunrise tends to do that to me, so I forgot to get the sage before I headed to work. Once I came home from work, it was already dark out, as I get off by the time the sun is setting. Around 2 a.m. I was taking out my dogs for the last time, and tonight there wasn't any ambience or chanting, and I stayed strictly to the small plot of yard directly in front of my house, but as I was once again taking out the last dog, I heard a noise to the east, and this absolutely scared me half to death. It sounded like something absolutely enormous had been knocked over or thrown down, something that was loud enough for me to hear hundreds of yards away. Immediately, too, I turned towards the noise and tugged on my dog's leash to drag them inside, keeping my back to the illuminated sections of my yard while I went in there. I've locked all my doors, my car, and all the other things that I can, and I've tried ignoring everything, but I just feel like I need some help now. These events are slowly escalating, and I only fear that tomorrow that it could bring on a full-on encounter with whatever this is. The fact that it's happened 3 nights in a row really hasn't helped with my sleeping patterns, but thankfully I finally got some sleep last night. And while I think that it could be a skinwalker maybe, I also think that it could be a wendigo. They're similar in nature, but if it was the latter though, I have a hunch that it would have made itself more known already. Whereas with a skinwalker, I think it could be trying to lure me out to the darkness of the shop. I've been trying to get a hold of a medicine man here in Oregon, but all I can find on Google is old articles, almost as if it refuses to let me find the help that I need so desperately. If anyone knows where I could find one to come and bless the house and the property, I would be elated to get this over with. These past few nights alone have been just terrible, and I would rather not have to see what I've heard described many a times for myself. Anyway, thanks for listening if you've made it this far, and any advice is very much welcomed at this point. I swear to you too that everything that I'm telling you guys is true, although I will happily admit that everything that I've speculated about may not be. I just really want some peace and quiet out here again, and if you can help with that, I would really appreciate it. So I went out to eat with a couple of friends, one of whom was up from out of state to visit. We turned off this highway onto an exit, and right around the corner, just out of sight after the turn, a white car is parked mostly in the road, with the door open. There's no hazards on, and the guy is just sitting there in the car. I got a horrible and instant realization too that it looked intentional and not a problem with this car. And so I yelled at her to reverse immediately. But then the guy gets out of his car, fist clenched, eyes bugged out of his head, stumbling and taking very strange sort of jerky steps directly towards us. She froze and started shaking, and I had to scream at her to reverse, even though cars are piling up behind us. I told her to let the cars go in front of us, to keep backing up slowly, and he ignores the other vehicles, still staring at the two girls in the front seat, just beelining right for us. We managed to pull up as the other vehicles are also trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and he seemed to get sort of confused by the moment of cars passing him now, and turns around and starts heading back to his vehicle. But I am positive that it was to grab some sort of a weapon or a gun or something. We managed to squeeze around and accelerate past him, and she's sobbing now. I turn around, and sure enough, he had something in his hand, but it was a little too far to see exactly what it was, and we were now out of distance, so he couldn't really reach us. But I am absolutely certain that this guy was on heavy drugs and alcohol and was having some sort of a psychotic breakdown from the looks of him. He wasn't asking for help, he wasn't trying to rob anyone. This guy just blocked traffic on a highway with the intention of probably murdering the first person that he was able to block in. I only just got home from this too, and I still have a lot of adrenaline rushing even now thinking about it, but I think I just need to try and calm myself down. So this happened to me and my mum last year, and we live in a pretty bad part of town. It's not unusual for us to encounter a couple of weirdos in our day-to-day life, but this one encounter really scared us both. We actually moved out shortly after this all happened. So, straight to the story. Me and my mum were just arriving home when we see a man standing in front of our main door, very skinny and tall, and looked like he was in his mid-40s. My mum questioned what he was doing and if he needed anything from us. He said that he was our new neighbour and that he would be living upstairs. Usually the landlord only rented the upstairs to tourists, so we thought that it was a little bit strange, but who cares, right? He said that he lost his key, though, and asked us if we had a spare. My mum told him of course we didn't, and that he would need to contact the landlord about that. He continued standing there, and we kind of had to push by him to get into our house. My mum quite assertively told him to step away, and I guess he got the hint, and then he left. A couple of days go by, and we haven't seen the man, but we have definitely been hearing him, because he'd been keeping us up basically every night. He was always knocking on the floor, like he was dropping marbles or hitting the broom on the wood or something. He would sing loudly in the middle of the night or just talk for hours and hours on end. He was either talking to himself or on the phone because we never heard anyone else's voice. But my mum is that type of person who just really doesn't put up with this type of disrespect, but she was trying hard not to start a conflict with our new neighbour. The breaking point, though, happens when he threw a big block of cement down from his balcony to our garden. My mum actually caught him doing it while one of our cats was minding its own business, just chilling on the grass. He was obviously aiming to hit him, but thankfully he ran away just in time. But my mum absolutely lost it, and she made her way upstairs. They got into a heated fight, and our front neighbours ended up having to break it up. My mum was really upset, and for a long time we didn't hear or see him. Now, for this last part, I need to just explain a little bit about how my house is built. So we have our main door, which is directed to a road, and we have a back entrance, which is where we have a small garden. The garden is surrounded by a wall as well. It's quite high, but wouldn't be completely impossible to jump over. My bedroom door goes out directly to the garden as well, and I usually leave my door cracked open so my cats can come in during the night. And based on that information, you've probably already guessed where this is going. So one night, while I'm already sound asleep, this twat jumped over our wall and creeped into my room. I actually woke up to him stroking my hair and cheek repeatedly. I slowly woke up and took a while to just kind of adjust my sight to realize that it was actually him. I screamed really loud and my mum rushed in swinging a lamp in her hand. He tried talking his way out of it, saying that he just needed our help and blah blah blah, but my mum was having none of it and continued to swing at him. He ran back out of the door, and we obviously didn't run after him. My mum just went straight to the door and locked it. We called the police, and right after that, our landlord. He wasn't dumb enough to go back upstairs because he knew for sure that the police were going to come for him now. So we needed all the information we could get about him to tell the police. The landlord was very confused though and said that he hadn't actually rented it and had no idea what we were talking about. And when the police arrived, they confirmed that he had actually busted the door lock and had been living inside for the past 2 weeks. I didn't go upstairs, but my mum did, and she said that it smelled so bad that she almost threw up because he had basically been just living in his own filth. Also, he apparently had been in my room before because the police found one of my pajama shorts upstairs. The police told us that he had a couple of sketchy things in his possession and to be careful not to leave any doors open in case he came back. He was never caught and we never actually saw him again. My mum swore that once in a while she could still hear him upstairs mumbling. We were both very paranoid for a long time and never really felt relaxed living there again, but about 2 months later, we moved out. Over the years that passed recently, my nan's mind started to go. She started seeing things more and more. My family were all saying that she's getting dementia, which I honestly believed too. But one night we got a phone call that she was found by the police walking the streets holding a clock, and that meant that it was definitely the start of her getting dementia. She got worse and worse as the months passed and had to be put into a nursing home, which meant that we had to get all of her possessions from her house and take them to her new residence. Honestly, I hated it. I've never liked that house. It's always seemed just like someone was watching you while you were in there. While you were getting all of her stuff too, which took about 4 days. Weird things just started happening. Like boxes that were stacked, maybe 3 cardboard boxes on top of each other, the size that you would get if you got a PC. The top one would just fall. But the strange thing is that it wouldn't land next to where it should have. It was maybe 2 or 3 feet away from the other 2 boxes. This didn't happen just once, too. It happened 6 times at least. Each time the box would land facing up, and my dad, who doesn't believe in anything paranormal, just brushed it off as the box as being uneven with the stuff inside. And I was like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll just go with that. On the 3rd day of moving her stuff, we had to carry the sofa and the armchair out. So me and my dad were lifting it, and my uncle was in another room just wrapping ornaments in newspaper. And as we were getting ready to lift it, my dad's face just turned completely white, and he nodded in the direction of the armchair. And there was an imprint in it that honestly looked like someone was sitting on it and leaning on the arm part. The leather was actually moving. Not a lot, only slightly, but it was noticeable. But that was enough for my dad to just walk straight out of that house. He said that he needed some fresh air, and he went outside and we were talking about it. I was bragging like, see, I told you. Do you believe this house is messed up now? He tried to push it off as maybe just one of us had sat on it or something, and it was moving back to its original position. As we were standing outside, I was smoking and just happened to look up, and the blinds upstairs moved, like someone was watching us and then moved away. My dad didn't see it, and again just tried to say that there was a rational explanation. Now, the fourth day was the last day that I ever spent in that house, and it was the worst time of my entire life. We were in my dad's bedroom and had to move a bed and wardrobe out. My dad and uncle grabbed the wardrobe and moved it out and into the van. But then came the words that I will never forget. "Hey, you stay here while we take this, okay? Put all the clothes into the bin bags, alright?" I walked up those stairs like I was walking to the electric chair. I walked into my nan's room and I closed the door. I had already seen shadows and other things walk past that door over the years that I'd been there, and I didn't want to see another one, that was for sure. So I was in her room just packing her stuff away and thinking of how she won't ever remember who I am or that she's even my nan. I packed up 3 bags to the point where they were almost bursting, and I sat on the bed. And then I heard noises like someone was in the attic moving. My stomach felt like it was turning and my heart was beating so fast. And then I heard what sounded like talking from the next room. It wasn't loud, it was just like a whispering, but it sounded kind of normal. It's hard to explain, but it was just one voice talking, but sounded like it was having a conversation. It was a male voice for sure, and I listened to that voice for about 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just stopped. I couldn't really make out anything that it said, except for a couple of things. Like, it said that there's no point, and just leave her over there. A few weeks passed, and I had visited my nan in the nursing home. She didn't remember who I was, but I'd still say to her, "Hello, Nan, you okay today?" and stuff like that. And her response was always the same. She would always say, "Yeah, I'm okay, mate." Except this day I said, "Good morning, Nan." And she said, "Anthony, where have you been? It's late." I felt so happy knowing that she remembered my name for that one day. But as time has gone on, she's gotten a lot worse. She tells me things about that house and other things too, but I don't know if it's just because of the dementia or if it's true. Anyway, I know that this is getting a bit long. I could honestly make a list a mile long of things that me and other people have seen, heard, or felt in that house, but I'll leave it here for now. I'll end with this though. I'll never forget the vibe of that house. It was just so depressing and like you were just constantly being watched. I grew up in an old Victorian terrace house in London. All over Britain, you have streets and streets of these traditional small 2-up, 2-down houses that are at least 100 years old. I lived here until I was 18 and have quite a few stories, but this one is weird, even by my standards. So just quickly, I need to describe the floor plan of my old home. In the old part of the house, there was a large room at the back, which we used as a dining room, and a small room at the front, which we used as the living room. There was also a hallway that ran alongside the living from the front door to the dining room door, and to the left of this door were the stairs that led up to the small landing that separated the front bedroom and the back bedroom. At the back of the dining room was a newer extension that created a long narrow kitchen and a bathroom at the end. The house was in pretty bad condition for years, with cracks between the walls and the ceiling that you could fit your hand in, and no central heating as well. So on this day, I was hanging out with my neighbour. We were about 8 years old at the time, and she was one of those bossy, no-nonsense, never-believed-in-Santa kind of kids. Old before her time, my mum would say. My aunt and my older cousin had come to visit, so I was taking full advantage of my mum being preoccupied with guests to keep playing with my neighbour. It must have been around 7 in the evening, I think, when my mum and my aunt ran out of cigarettes and decided to drive to the petrol station to get some more. This was the early 90s, and UK stops were pretty strict about closing at 5 PM, so the garage, which was a 10-minute drive away, was the only option. I told my mum that I wanted to stay with my neighbour, and after checking that it was okay with her mother, my mum, my aunt, and my cousin and older brother left in the car. My friend and I messed around for a bit before deciding to go into my house to get a toy. Mostly we thought that it'd be exciting to play in the house with no adults around. And I can still remember the weird sense of foreboding and expectance that I could feel while we were in there, like something was going to happen when we entered the room. The neighbor kid could also feel it too, so we decided to wait outside on the wall. As I walked through the dining room door to head out of the front door, something moved out of the corner of my eye though. I looked up the stairs and I watched as my family walked in single file across the landing from the back bedroom to the front bedroom. This obviously confused me as I hadn't heard the car return or heard them climb the stairs, so I called out, "Hey, I didn't know you guys were back." But no one answered. So I began running up the stairs calling out to my mum, and as I got about halfway up, my blood just instantly ran cold. I realized then that both doors were shut and had been when they walked across, and also the lights were off. And so I ran. I jumped the stairs and I ran out the front door with my neighbor right behind me. Outside, I told her about the doors being closed and how I couldn't understand why my family looked like that. I saw them clear as day though, walking in height order with my mum first and my brother last, but what had creeped me out most was just how expressionless their faces were, kind of like sleepwalkers. My neighbor then told me that she didn't actually see my family, only shadows moving across the landing, and had been too scared to move until I started running. I was honestly terrified at the time that if I'd seen their ghost, did this mean that something had happened to my family? And after an agonizing 5-minute wait, my aunt's car finally pulled up and they got out. I immediately began demanding to know why they didn't answer me when they came back before, but of course they didn't know what I was talking about. I don't know what I saw up there that day, but I'm really glad that it wasn't actually them. I moved to Denton about a year and a half ago now. I was always told, too, that it was a pretty safe place, and I felt the same when I lived in my first house. So when I moved to my new place about 8 months ago, I didn't think that it would be much different. Actually, I thought that it would be safer since my last place, my roommates never, and I mean never, locked the doors. In the new place, I have a roommate and a big dog, so that makes me feel safer too. We lived in a good area where there were families around and stuff, but since I've moved here, there have been 4 different instances where men have come to my house and done something really strange. All have occurred at night from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. Here's the first one. So the first one happened about a month into us living here. It was 3 a.m. and the doorbell rang, and I mean, who the hell would be at my door right now? As I'm walking to the door, I can see and hear this person trying to get in. Me, terrified, I look through the peephole and I see the silhouette of a guy that looks like my roommate's ex. They had just broken up, so I wake her up and I tell her. She opens the door a few minutes later and the guy just isn't there anymore. She peeps her head out of the door and sees that same guy inside my car. I'm a dumb person and I didn't lock it that day, so she yelled at him and he just sprinted away. The second time it was 9 p.m. and I'm home alone. Someone rings the door and my lazy ass didn't get up to get it. A couple of minutes later, the door rings again. But this time I get up and no one's at the door. I open it and I see 2 men in an SUV pulling into my driveway. They're almost all the way up to the house, and once they see me, they stop the car, put it into reverse, and leave. I don't know what they wanted or were going to do, but it was weird. Another night, my roommate is home alone. It's 9:30 p.m. and the door rings. She doesn't get it, thinking that it must be her Amazon package or something, and they'll just leave it at the door. The door rings again though, so confused, she gets up and looks through the peephole. There's a guy with a black ball cap on, and he's looking down so she can't actually see his face. She asks, "Can I help you?" "Hey, I have your Amazon package here." Okay, do I need to sign or anything?" He then says, "No." "Okay, can you just leave it on the ground then?" And then he just ends up standing there for a minute or so. She nervously stares back at him through the peephole, waiting for him to walk away. He eventually does walk away, but for about an hour and a half after that, our big-ass dog keeps growling at the door. I can attest to the fact that she has never done anything like that. Another weird thing too is that Amazon stops delivering at 9 p.m. Maybe he was just running late? Now, the last one is definitely the creepiest. This happened last month at around 1:30 a.m. and I wasn't home, but my roommate was, with her boyfriend Alex. They're laying in bed, and from the corner of Alex's eye, he sees a pair of eyes in the crack of the blinds from her window. He gets up and runs outside and sees a grown-ass man in a construction vest looking through a window. The guy jumps when he sees Alex and grabs our trash cans right next to her window. He pretends to just be a trash dude, kindly taking our empty trash cans out for us. Didn't know that they had night shifts now, on Fridays. Trash only comes Monday and Wednesday mornings here. So yeah, we have no idea who this guy was, but he got out of there quickly. Those are my stories, and I've heard that there's a man that the DPD are looking for. He's forcing himself into women's apartments in Denton, and it's sad that I have to live in fear because I'm a target being a woman. I know that it may sound a bit dramatic to many, but after all of these experiences that I've had, can you blame me? On top of this guy that's been named a serial offender on the loose too, I'm pretty terrified to live alone next semester. I've never been scared of that, and I'm a pretty tall and heavier woman, and I've grown up with all brothers. I thought that I knew how to fight, but now I'm just like, could I help myself? I don't really know, and I'm generally a calm and collected person, but this is giving me really bad anxiety every time that I'm home alone and I hear something. Anyway, thanks for listening to my stories, and if any of you guys have experienced anything like this around here, I would love to know that I'm not alone.
Quick update before we begin. For those excited about our upcoming book, Westfall, I have the unfortunate news that the book will no longer be released in October of this year. After reviews from beta readers, we feel it's best to flesh out the entire story into a much longer single book. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I think it would be best to deliver something that is exciting for you all and a joy to experience. Now then, today I've got some new and terrifying hunting stories. So if you're not a fan of hunters, you'd better go on and get, 'cause we Southerners are hunters, and I love me a good deer steak, no joke. Enjoy these terrifying stories and be sure to send me your unexplained and creepy experiences at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Also, check out eeriecast.com for more terrifying podcasts like this. Now, let's begin. Warning. The following account contains depictions of violence against animals and also contains depictions of assault against men and women. My 2 paranormal experiences. From Tyler H.G. 2021. These stories are not one but 2 of the most strange, terrifying, and paranormal things that ever happened to me in my life. I will never forget them. Both of my stories, these creatures I encountered, were totally different from each other. This first encounter happened when I was hunting with some friends back in September of 2011. The other encounter occurred at a cabin in October of 2014. While these stories are true, I will change the names of those involved for confidentiality. Now let's get started. I live towards the Glacier National Park, just northwest of Montana, where I grew up. Most of my life, I lived on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, a place where you'll hear scary tales of the Goat Man, stories of campers going missing in the middle of the woods, where the Stick Indians come out and take people away in the night. Now, I would describe myself as 6'2", a medium build with a beard. Being of mixed race and having very light skin living on the reservation all my life, I hung around a lot with my cousin Dan. Dan was 2 years younger than me, liked sports, and was very good at basketball and played for the high school team. Together, we did a lot of hiking and hunting, also a bit of drinking, smoking, chasing women, and just kicking it with the boys every now and then. My cousin introduced me to his 2 friends for the first time out on a hunting trip back in 2008. We'll call them Big Tom and Mouse. Big Tom was just a big, silly guy who enjoyed talking about football and would always start singing to the country music playing on the radio, sitting in the front passenger seat in the truck. We would drive down the country roads and he would crack open a cold one. Mouse was 5'6", wore glasses, and had what you call a short man complex. He always had to get competitive over who's the best at what all the time. Later down the road, on my own, I would also start getting into different varieties of hunting wild game. Ducks, grouses, other bird hunting, varmint trapping, and learning how to make coyote hides. I would always go for the more exotic type of hunting rifles and guns. I would usually go for the guns that were the most efficient and accurate for the purposes I needed them. I would carry a Remington 7600 pump action, while the other guys just carried bolt-action rifles. Sometime in September of 2011, all of us were in our early to mid-20s at the time. It was just the beginning of rifle season. I picked up my cousin at his house in my white 1995 Ford Bronco with 2 big light bars on the top, which I used for spotlighting sometimes. On our way up, we picked up Big Tom and Mouse. We were all trying to decide what place we wanted to go to do some hunting for the day. Big Tom suggested we go out to his uncle's place, which is about 43 miles north out of town. As we get about 30 miles out of town, we came to a dirt road. Out that far, there was nothing but flats and hills, a few old-time grain bins, and some solar panels and oil rig pumps that you can see out in the distance. As we came up to this old radar base, a green and silver striped Dodge Ram Charger passed us on the road. Inside were what appeared to be 2 older-looking men. We tried to wave at them, but the 2 guys just gave us odd looks as we drove by them. After making it to Big Tom's uncle's place, he goes in to check to see if he's home first, to make sure his uncle knows that we'll be out there doing some hunting in the area. Big Tom warned us about his uncle, saying that he can be a bit of a Looney Tune at times. As we were getting ready and geared up to hunt, Big Tom comes back out, letting us know his uncle wasn't home, but it would still be okay to hunt, as long as his uncle was still away. Big Tom was saying he had to go really bad all day, and luckily his uncle had an outhouse just outside the place. After that's done, we start to walk into what's probably about 200 acres of forest. There is a creek running through it, just behind Big Tom's uncle's place. We decided to split up into 2s. Tom and Mouse headed out together, while my cousin Dan and I began to follow the creek all the way up. Then we made a plan to all meet up with Big Tom and Mouse down the trail. As Dan and I walked about 2 miles into the forest, we came across 2 competitive white-tailed bucks fighting for dominance. Dan and I got down on our knees and belly crawled, taking our time and approaching the deer closer and closer while they were distracted with each other. Soon they were only about 10 yards into the brush in front of us. Dan and I take the shot, each killing a deer. We then waited for Big Tom and Mouse to show up. As Dan and I started to walk further into the brush, we were suddenly startled by some birds. Then, right there in front of us, we saw a horse. However, right away, we noticed something odd about it. It looked strange and was just standing stiff. We approached this horse, realizing it wasn't moving, and it appeared to be hunched over a log. As we walked around the animal, let's just say what we saw was not a very pretty sight to look at. The rear end of this horse was torn wide open, and there were buzzards all over the place. I didn't see any other wounds on the dead animal, and I couldn't help but notice the tail had been braided. Later, when we met up with Big Tom and Mouse, we told them about the dead horse and took them to see it as well. A stiff and still standing dead horse with a chunk out of its rear. We cracked a joke then, saying that Mouse was just the right size to fit into that gaping hole in the horse and make a bed for the night. It was getting late then. We started to quarter up me and Dan's deer. We found some good long pointy sticks lying on the ground nearby. We used it to poke through each front and hind quarter and carry the meat over our shoulders. Getting back on the road, we found some tracks that went into the forest behind Big Tom's uncle's place. I turn only my light bars on while driving through a creepy dark forest at night, and this was just such an occasion. With my light bars on brighter than heck, we spotted some porcupines in the brush. I reached into the back of my Bronco and take out my laser-sighted crossbow. I loaded a bolt, put my sighting on it, and used the lace to aim and shoot it. I retrieved my prey and wrapped it up, throwing it in the back with the rest of the quartered deer. While leaving from there, we were talking and joking until suddenly, wham, something runs up and hits the side of my Bronco. We all were startled and jumped. I was driving at the time, and I said, "What the heck was that?" We rolled down the windows to look around. Big Tom even pointed his .44 Magnum outside the car. We looked around a bit, but didn't see anything weird, so we just kept going. A few days later, I told one of my other friends who's kind of a conspiracy theorist. He said a guy named Victor who lives on the reservation told him about something called a witch's braid. These appear on horses overnight. He mentioned a story where the woman thought it was cute that something would braid her horse's tail's hair at night. The same woman even said she witnessed Bigfoot attacking her horse and would even hold on to the tail while doing so. This caused the horse's tail hair to get all tangled in a braid-like pattern. When I told my conspiracy theorist friend about this, he mentioned that his grandpa told his mom that the tribe believed that Bigfoot would sometimes even kidnap women. In the Paiute tribe in California, there's a legend that states that a woman was kidnapped and assaulted by Bigfoot. The woman escaped, but it is said that she had a hybrid baby. The boy looked mostly normal, but was hairier. He grew up to have immense strength, better senses of smell and sight than normal people. In recent years, there was an article written about Bigfoot attempting to take a male Colorado hunter while he hunted in the forest. And there's a 2006 Bigfoot documentary that took place near the Glacier National Park, where someone found a small Bigfoot leg that had weird webbed feet. I think the documentary is called Bigfoot Lives. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix. So basically, maybe it was Bigfoot we encountered out there. Maybe that's what ran up on our truck and hit it. Some weird stuff is going on out in those woods. Now on to my second story. Going back to 2000, my dad just bought a cabin from an old guy who used to work for the railroads. It was a small yellow cabin, which had a small bunkhouse just 3 feet in front of the cabin. About 500 feet west from the cabin, there was a train car. You couldn't see it unless you walked behind some pine trees. Also about 200 feet from the cabin in a different direction was one of those old, barely traveled country highways. This was truly out in the middle of nowhere. When my dad got to the cabin, I was only 12 at the time and my brother was 9 or 10, and it was our first time going into the cabin. I could see a pellet gun just sitting there in the corner. I took it outside and began shooting it around. I walked down to the bushes where there was a pond nearby. As I looked around, I saw some ducks swimming. I pointed the pellet gun ready to shoot at the ducks, but my dad caught me and said, "Don't be shooting those ducks now." He even told me, "Would you like it if I shot you?" When my dad went back inside the cabin and was out of hearing range, I grabbed the pellet gun and took a shot, killing a duck. I watched it floating there in the water. I guess I just wanted to see what it was like to shoot something for the first time. I was a kid, and I didn't really understand what I was doing. Then I remember having this really scary dream at the cabin. In it, I was walking out to the living room, and I looked out the window, and I saw a deer, which should have been dead by the looks of it, but it was standing there looking back at me. It had these white, dead, lifeless eyes, and as it ran off into the woods, it made this unsettling screeching sound. That dream always psychologically disturbed me every time I thought about it. My dad would tell me I must have seen something on TV that gave me a nightmare. Much later in August of 2013, my cousin Dan and I, along with his dad, went for a little hike towards the mountain hillside in the Lewis and Clark National Forest. It was just south of the Glacier National Park nearby where the cabin was. I brought with me a 12-inch single-shot 10-gauge that I'd inherited from my grandpa after he passed away 8 years before. As we went deeper into the woods, we stumbled across an old run-down trailer house and some kind of barn shed on the side of the trailer used for putting horses in. When I stepped into the barn shed part, I was startled by these big yellow eyes that I saw staring back at me. It was an owl. My cousin's dad told me that it was a bad omen, that it would bring me bad luck if I didn't kill it. So I did as he said and pointed my 10-gauge at it. I pulled the hammer, then took the shot. As I watched the bird hit the ground, I walked away. I wanted to go check out what was all in the trailer after that. I walked around the living room of the old rundown trailer home, and I heard a thud. I turned around to see what made the noise. Standing on a table staring right at me with big yellow eyes was another owl, or perhaps the same owl, but it should have been dead. Just as before, I took my grandpa's tin gauge, pointed it at the bird, then fired. After leaving the place and getting up a little ways, I was looking around again using binoculars. I could see my dad's cabin about 5 or 6 miles north from our location. I told my cousin where my dad's cabin was in the distance, and that we should check it out later, and he agreed. Later that day, my cousin and I picked up a few girls and decided to make our way up to that cabin. We got into my dad's cabin, and the first thing we noticed was there was no electricity. We hadn't lived in it for a while, and my dad didn't pay on the bill for a long time. We were sitting around in the living room in the cabin, and we found some old chopped up wood. While making a fire, we started to tell jokes and drink. After a while, me and Dan get really blacked out and started a fist fight. After that happened, Dan and the 2 girls headed out. I was left at the cabin alone. I was getting tired, and I decided to head for bed. It was a king-sized bed with a bed frame made out of logs. While sleeping, I felt as if I couldn't move all of a sudden, and then I began to hear a voice, but I couldn't make out what it was saying at first. When I turned my head just a bit, I saw at the foot of my bed a sort of undead human-like entity. It had bleeding eyes and was staring at me angrily. It seemed really teed off. I'm not sure what about. It kept repeating the words,
"The devil is here. The devil is here."
But when it would talk, its mouth would not move at all. Somehow still words came from it. In appearance, it reminded me of a ghoul from Fallout 3. After a while, it disappeared, and the next morning I left. The next week, me and my cousin Dan get over the fight that we had that day and decided to make up. Dan's dad, my cousin Dan, and me decided to go for a hike at the same place. After hiking for a while, we stopped by a creek and smoked a bit. After smoking, Dan and his dad decided to take a little walk. I waited down by the creek as they took their time walking through the woods and happened to just doze off while waiting for Dan and his dad to get back. As I lay there on the rocks, I heard this chilling voice call my name. I heard it coming from the forest when I woke from my short little nap. I realized Dan and his dad weren't back yet, so I got up and walked around to loosen up a bit. I needed it as I kept thinking about that weird voice that called my name. I remember it sounding really strange and disorienting, sort of like a hollow echo. What if nature was teed off at me and the wilderness was trying to send me some kind of message? A year after that, September of 2014, one afternoon around 2 p.m., I was in my newly purchased truck with a lever-action rifle hanging on the gun racks behind my head. I was driving down the road coming up from the mountain pass. After arriving at my dad's cabin, I realized I hadn't been there in a year. The last time I was there, me and Dan got drunk and fought. I decided to stop at the cabin on the way through. After getting out of the truck and walking up to the cabin, I peered into the window, and I saw someone inside. It was a man with light brown hair. He was wearing glasses and looked to be about 5'10". He was sitting on the couch, changing his socks. His face looked very startled when he saw me through the window. I ran inside, hitting him in the face and breaking his glasses. He was knocked to the floor. He looked up at me with his hand covering his nose. I told him, "What the heck are you doing here? Get out! My dad owns this place." The guy looked really ashamed and embarrassed. He apologized over and over and got up and left. After I told my dad that a man broke into his cabin, he told me to check for anything missing or if anything looked out of place. I let my dad know nothing was missing, but the back door was broken down and there was a nail stuck through the latch on the side of the window. Likely the guy put it there so that the window wouldn't shut all the way and he could get back in. My dad decided that maybe it would be a good idea if I stayed at the cabin, and he said he would get the electricity turned back on if I did. Remembering what I saw that day last year, I thought maybe it wouldn't be as bad staying there this time with some light in the place, and maybe some company. My dad and I fixed the place up a little. We boarded up the back door and tried to get the side windows shut. It was nailed down pretty good. Only a month later, in October of 2014, we got the place fixed up decent enough. At 8 p.m. one night, I went out to visit the cabin to see if the lights were on. When entering the cabin, there was a small shed in the front about the size of an elevator. There are kerosene lamps, a handsaw, and some snowshoes on the wall. Anyway, everything in the cabin looked good so far. The lights were running again, and I could hear the radio playing on the kitchen counter. I was thinking about staying for the night. I thought I could use some company though, so I decided to run to town. As I was leaving, pulling out of the driveway in my truck, I saw at the corner of my eye something just fly by. It landed somewhere on the ground in the dark. I didn't get too good of a look at it, but I thought I saw something that had a really long wingspan, more than just an ordinary bird around these parts. I then continued on my way, going to pick up my brother and our two friends, Ed and Cole. Ed was 6'2" and always wore a green alien cap. He had short dark hair, had a beard like me, and always enjoyed talking about conspiracy theories like UFOs and the paranormal. Cole had really long hair and wore black Cannibal Corpse t-shirts. All four of us liked metal music, and we'd all talk about going to a music concert one day. My younger brother Anthony was also big into music, but he wasn't into as hardcore of bands as Cole was. At the time, Anthony would sometimes have really bad seizures. I made sure to keep a really close eye on him. Back at the cabin, we were all sitting around inside, passing a blunt, listening to the radio. We picked up a station from the reservation of two native guys telling scary stories about skinwalkers and goatmen. It was probably just for the Halloween weekend, I guessed, as it was October. After a while, I stood up to go take a look out the window. I was peeking through the big red curtains of the living room window, and I saw something very strange. About 150 feet from the road in front of the cabin, and about 30 feet behind my truck, standing on the ground, I saw a bird-like creature. But it wasn't just any kind of bird I saw. Something didn't look right about it. It had a head and a neck almost like a man, but it had something weird above its head. It looked like some kind of horns. I couldn't make out what the face looked like. The bird thing stood there just staring back at the cabin. I tried to tell the other guys what I saw outside. I tried showing them, but about the time we all looked out the window together, it was gone. Soon after, we all got tired. Ed and Cole headed for the back bedroom with 2 extra beds. My brother headed for a different bedroom, and I slept in the living room. Alone in the living room, I soon noticed there were 2 wooden owl statues. I figured my dad must have picked them up at a thrift store and put them there when we were fixing the place up. Both of them were standing on the top shelf, just on the far side from each other, right above the TV. I went ahead and made a fire on the wood stove. When I went back to sit on the couch, I looked up at one of the owls. Thoughts were going through my mind as the creepy owl statue stared back at me, now lit by the light of the fire. I couldn't help but feel guilty as I thought back to the day I killed those owls last year. I began getting these creepy vibes, so I turned on the lamp by the window. I then decided to crash out on the couch. At some point, I was awakened and began to hear something just out of the half-opened window. It was the one that wouldn't shut all the way, which was just behind the coffee table and lamp I just turned on. The sound outside got closer and closer to the window. I started to feel like I couldn't move. It was all happening again just like last time. I could only move my eyes, and I could only hear what was around me. Then I heard something that sounded really weird. It was right outside the window by the coffee table. It sounded like a growl mixed with a muffled noise. I looked out the window. There I saw that bird thing I'd seen outside, now bursting its head through the crack in the window. It was flapping and screeching about. Now that I got a close-up look at it, I saw that the creature had no face and had a mix of feathers and fur with long, pointy horns, sort of like an antelope. The creature was trying to get in through the window. Its head was convulsing and swinging, flapping around fast and unnaturally. I finally snapped out of my sleep paralysis nightmare. I jumped up from the couch and rushed to the gun rack to my grandpa's single-shot 10-gauge shotgun. I spun around as fast as I could, and I shot the window where I saw the creature trying to enter through. But once I came to my senses, I realized the creature was now gone. Not long after that, my brother, Ed, and Cole came rushing out, looking surprised and concerned at what they just heard. The blast was very loud after all. My brother was like, "What the heck are you doing? Dad's going to be teed off, you shot out the window." We all stood there, mostly confused, trying to make sense of what just happened. I told everyone about what I saw. We looked out the window but didn't see anything weird. Ed, with his conspiracy theories, thought probably the entity could have used some kind of telepathic power to invade my dreams. Maybe it wanted to reveal itself and terrorize me. It seemed to have looked like it had the features and traits of all the animals I killed combined into one, coming back as a nightmare to get revenge on me for all the animals I've killed. Cole heard the same growling, mumbling sounds that I heard. Meanwhile, there was no other damage to the cabin, save for what we cleaned up, which would be broken glass lying around. We then cut out some cardboard and placed it on the side window to cover the crack. The lampshade was pretty shredded up, though. After the incident, we all tried going back to bed. Later on, I got up to go to the kitchen. I then suddenly saw this black figure going into the bedroom where Anthony was sleeping. I went to check on my brother to see if he was okay. When I opened the door, there he was on the bed. He was bleeding from the mouth and going into a seizure. I rushed in fast, getting over him and pulling out my wallet, trying to get it into his mouth to keep him from biting his tongue. I called out to Ed and Cole for help. I said, "That's it, we're taking him to the hospital." It was around 3 a.m. then, and we carried him out to the truck. As I drove out of the driveway and got up the road, we all headed for town. I'll never forget that night. Around that time, 2 of my closest relatives to me passed away in 2016. It almost seemed more than a coincidence that I killed 2 owls, and around that same year, those 2 people died. The next time you ever go into the woods and you see a messenger-like owl, do not kill it. You might get haunted by some kind of creature or nightmare out for revenge. Mushroom hunting. From David Chase. One night in the middle of May of 2018, 2 of my friends and I had been hanging out, drinking, and joking around, just having a good time. It was around 2 a.m. by then, and we decided to go morel hunting out at the river, which is less than a 5-minute walk away. Morels are an edible mushroom, by the way. As we half-drunkenly looked for morels, we weren't having any luck and soon lost hope. We sat down on a dead fallen tree to take a break for a while, before we would head back to the car, which was about a quarter mile away by then. As we were sitting there, drinking some beers, we started talking about creepy places to explore and stories we've heard. As we got around to finally leaving, we joked about Bigfoot. We got the idea to do some wood knocks, since all 3 of us were into these kinds of things, and supposedly Bigfoot liked to knock on wood. We started walking farther into the woods paralleling the river, joking and making whooping yells and doing wood knocks. The same kind of stuff you see on those Bigfoot hunting TV shows. But no luck with any responses. We eventually came to a stop, and that's when we had a new idea. We'd try whistling really loud. Now, on this side of the river, you could holler and make all the noise you wanted, but you never got a good echo here. Not unless you were on the cliff on the opposite side of the river. Well, one of my friends whistled as loud as they could, and it wasn't about 3 seconds later that we heard the exact same whistle, like someone or something had mimicked it. And soon after that mimic, the woods fell completely silent. Now, why wouldn't the woods go silent for my friend's whistle, and only go quiet for the mimic? Our little group looked at each other in shock. My friend made another whistle, but a different kind, and it was mimicked back just as before. It came from the other side of the river, but it was closer now than before. It was at that second we decided we needed to leave. My friends wanted to run, but I told them no, because if there was something out there hunting us, it may pounce on us or chase us if we ran. I led them to the ATV trail. We told each other to only step on the sand, That way, we'd make as little noise as possible. As we steadily marched in the direction of the car, we began to hear sticks and leaves crunching on one side of us. We stopped. Whatever it was took one more step and stopped too. Then we started to walk faster. We were almost to the bend then. That was near where the car was parked. We stopped once more and we heard the crunch again. And once again the follower stopped. Except now it was way closer, still on the other side of us. By the time we came within about 25 feet of the car, we unlocked it via the remote and we couldn't stop ourselves any longer from running. We got away okay, and we never went back. Still to this day, I refuse to drive through that area after sunset. At least, not without a gun. Almost Caught by the Rake. From William J. I was 12 years old when I went on a hunting trip with my father. That day, we woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning and got our stuff ready. We went to this wooded area somewhere in California. Sorry if my memory's a bit vague. We got into our spot we always went to. It was this place with a little dirt mound and small trees around it. However, that day when we got there, I immediately felt that there was something off. The whole forest was quiet. Normally, there would be bugs and birds and a whole lot of other stuff. But there was just silence. The only noise was the leaves and twigs that snapped under our boots as we walked. We arrived at the mound and began waiting for a good buck to bag, but nothing came. About an hour after we arrived at the mound, we began to hear the familiar sound of leaves crunching. "You hear that?" I whispered. "Yep," my dad replied. We kept hearing the leaves, then, out of nowhere, there came this horrific scream. I jumped, and so did my dad. After we heard that scream, we decided it was time to leave. We began walking away, always keeping an eye out for whatever that thing had been. But then I saw it. A tall man, except it wasn't a normal man. It was far too tall, maybe 8 to 10 feet tall, and had paper-white skin that was so tight on it that you could see every last bone inside. The thing had bony, long fingers and giant claws. Its face was horrible. It had black beady eyes and a triangular-shaped mouth that emitted another horrible-sounding scream. My dad and I hightailed it out of there, with the creature staying right behind us the whole way. We got to the truck and looked behind us at the tree line. We saw the thing just standing there. Then it walked back into the forest, never to be seen again by me nor my father. Easy to say I could have been snatched up by that thing so easy that day, and I'd say I'm pretty lucky to be here and to be alive. Thank you for listening to another unsettling episode of Unexplained Encounters. You can send us your story to have it narrated on the show at darkstories.org. Unexplained Encounters is an EerieCast original series. You can find other horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com, such as Redwood Bureau, a fictional anthology series, Freaky Folklore, a documentary-style series about myths and cryptids around the world, Destination Terror, a show about the most haunted places, and Tales from the Break Room, another show I host all about the scary things that happen to people at work. Again, that's EerieCast.com. By the way, if you want fewer annoying ads and you want to support what we do, consider going to EerieCast.com/plus to sign up for EerieCast Plus. That unlocks all our podcasts with all but host-read ads removed. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.